It might be difficult to see why this Square-1 is cursed. It looks simple enough, right? Just a Square-1 with curved vertical cuts. But when you actually start scrambling it, a lot of moves you want to make just don't line up. Very few Square-1 algorithms actually work properly on this puzzle. And yet, despite being quite a different challenge, it looks like a relatively normal Square-1. That's why it's called the cursed Square-1. In this video, I'll show you why this puzzle is so cursed from a conceptual level, and then the build and stickering process, and then finally a demonstration, scramble, and solve. And if you enjoy unique custom puzzles such as this one, like and subscribe. But now, let's get into the cursed Square-1's origins. So what makes the cursed Square-1 cursed? Well, considering the fact that I posted a picture of this, and several modders said they couldn't tell what the difference is going to be from a Square-1 with regards to solve, I'd like to explain why simply curving the cuts makes for a significantly different solve. So, what is a deep cut puzzle? A deep cut puzzle is where at least one cut cuts the puzzle exactly in half. So you can see that if I turn the puzzle like this, exactly halfway is where all of the parts move. That's where the dividing line is. And because this is a 2x2, it so happens that it's deep cut on all three of its axes. Then you have something like the Scube, which is also deep cut. You'll notice that every turn affects exactly half of the puzzle. And the thing about deep cut puzzles is because just of the way the geometry works, you can't really have them be curved or wavy or anything. You ever noticed how you've seen plenty of wild 3x3 mods where the cuts are made to be something totally different, like the Pandora Cube and all these other random mods? Well, you've never seen any 2x2s like that, and that's just because it's deep cut. So if you were to actually curve these cuts, you'd get something that's barely a puzzle because it might not even be able to turn properly. And it's similar with the Scube, although the Scube is actually a more unique case, so you've seen more adventurous Scube mods. This goes to the fact that the Square-1 is deep cut in a single axis, and that's this axis. You can see that when you make the vertical turn, exactly half of the puzzle turns, no matter what you do. And then these turns, the face turns, they're not deep cut, they're shallow cut. So with these cuts, you can curve them without any issues, and you can see here that I did so for the shattered Square-1. However, in the video for this, I mentioned that I didn't want to curve the vertical cuts because that would introduce a lot of additional complexity, and I only wanted to tackle one concept at a time. So I left the vertical cut straight, despite everything else being curved. I also want to quickly note that the Kilo Minx, despite kind of being a Mega Minx 2x2, is not deep cut, because you can see that it's actually still just shallow cut, because the center line of the puzzle would be like here or something, but this turns nowhere near that. An actual deep cut dodecahedron would be the big chop. But yeah, so going back to the Square-1, just to quickly recap, this is deep cut, which means it cuts the puzzle exactly in half, which means you can't curve this cut. That's technically illegal. And that kind of starts to explain why the curved Square-1 is going to have some weird things going on, because technically this is something that's geometrically illegal. But you may actually remember, I've done something kind of like this before, right? Where this is basically a 3x3x5 equivalent of a Square-1, where it still has edges and corners, but except now there's also this central layer. This puzzle doesn't actually turn that badly, just have to align it. See? So you still have your edges, except now there's two different types. You have your corners, and then you have these additional edges. And on this puzzle, it actually doesn't matter whether or not these cuts are curved. Everything is curved, but it doesn't make a difference. This is the Waterfall Cube Ultimate, by the way. On this, nothing is a deep cut. So if I were to straighten out all of these cuts, it would turn exactly the same. Just I chose the curved cuts for aesthetic reasons. However, if you remember the follow-up puzzle to that, the Waterfall Cube Supreme, which is based on a 4x4, these central cuts actually are straight, and that's because they are deep cut. So again, there was no easy way for me to curve them. And likewise, these slices here exactly through the corners, once again, this is deep cut, so it's straight. So going back to this, the reason why you don't see things like curved 2x2s is just because a lot of times the puzzle might not be able to function very well. It might not scramble properly, or it might scramble just a tiny bit. So this was actually a pretty big experiment. I had no clue whether or not this was even going to be a usable puzzle, and honestly, it was a pleasant surprise when I discovered that it was actually alright. This is a thing you can scramble and solve and spend time on. It's not just a gimmick. Now, all that talk might be a bit confusing for someone who isn't into puzzle design, so let me put in much simpler terms why this puzzle doesn't work like a Square-1. This edge is mirrored from this edge, so they are not mechanically identical, whereas on a Square-1, these edges are all mechanically identical. So this edge physically can't occupy the space that this edge does. And likewise, these two are the same, and these two are the same, but they're mirrors of each other, and the same applies here. And the Square-1, you can move it so freely because most of the parts are actually the same. The corners are all equivalent, and the edges are all equivalent. But here, let's see, you have effectively 4 different types of corners. These are all different, and 2 different types of edges. So the fact that the pieces are much less interchangeable is the end result of these curved cuts. And that's why you see, if you were to turn it like this, on a Square-1, everything matches up here, because these parts are all the same and meet at this central line. But here, they're not all the same. And the way these are laid out makes it so that nothing actually comes to the center. You have to turn it by 90 degrees, and then you get a different configuration of parts that actually does come into the center. So overall, this should make for a very interesting puzzle, and doing something like this, a curved deep cut puzzle, has been on my to-do list for quite a while because, it's kind of fun to do something that you're really not supposed to be doing. So that's part of why I enjoy this, and let's get to the build. So here's a first assembled prototype of the curved Square-1, and it turns pretty decently. So if I turn it like this, it's still quite stiff because I haven't finished breaking it in, but if at this stage it turns like this, I know it's going to break in quite decently. But what I've realized with this design actually is that these corners right here, the little ones specifically, not the tiny ones, I guess the asymmetrical ones, because the symmetrical ones are fine, but they tend to block turns when the puzzle gets a bit more scrambled. So actually, let's see, if I turn it like this, if I turn it like this, there you go. So you can see that the lines do line up. I should be able to make this turn, but this corner of this corner piece just juts out far enough so that this turn is impossible unless I force it, which I really don't want to. And that's the first type of part that I've noticed tends to block parts mid-turn. Let me see if I can make a setup so I can show you the other one. And here's the other type. Look and see that this actually appears to be a turn that you should be able to make. However, this long corner, not the short one, the long corner, goes into the central area just enough so that you can't really make the turn. However, upon further scrambling, I actually realized that this isn't the only case in which these long corners can block moves. So this is going to be harder to show you, but real quick, let me get this into another configuration where it will make sense. So I'm having kind of a hard time getting this cube into a position where I can actually show you properly, but basically these long corners can also block turns at a deeper level than just the tip right there, as I showed you earlier. And part of why it's actually hard for me to get this cube into a configuration to show you that is because of how restrictive these pieces are. So I was tinkering around in the design, trying to cut down these long corners to not block anything, and then I realized by doing that I actually made them identical to these short corners that you see here, here, and here. So I printed out some more short edges and modified these asymmetrical corners to have a bit chopped off so that turns can be made. And here are the new parts. So let's disassemble the cube and then reassemble it with the new parts, which I also have a couple more of right here. Let's get to it. You might be wondering why I even bothered with unbandaging the puzzle. Could I not have just left the corners and the edges as is and the puzzle would have been a bit more difficult? Well, there's a few things that play into this, and it's something you always have to be conscious of whenever you're designing a puzzle with bandaging. So in this case, the bandaging was kind of slight, right? Like, you could still technically force the puzzle to turn even if it's an invalid move. And that's a bad type of bandaging, because especially if you give the puzzle to someone else, they might be confused about whether or not they're supposed to make certain moves. And you also have to think about it from a fun perspective. I don't really plan on making another curved Square-1 anytime within the near future, so I wanted to make one definitive version that would be the most unique and interesting to solve. And I made the decision that because the curvature of the cuts already bandages the puzzle pretty significantly, these corner tips and edge tips were superfluous to the solving experience and would frankly make it more annoying rather than just providing more difficulty. So I made the decision to truncate all of the parts and thus make the most unbandaged version possible of the cursed Square-1. Alright, so the curved Square-1 is fully assembled now, and I'm going to break it in a bit more off camera, but overall, given how it turns right now, I think it'll turn out really smoothly turning. So yeah, and after that I'm going to sticker this puzzle up. Stickering this should have been straightforward, but somehow I first forgot to cut blue stickers entirely, and then I cut the wrong blue stickers, so all in all I had to use my vinyl cutter 3 times, but I still managed to make this incredibly epic stickering time lapse. Oh wait, it's over. Overall, this is a really interesting puzzle, and I'm not sure why exactly I waited this long to make it. What I do find fascinating about the cursed Square-1 is the fact that from the solved state, if you just make a turn, then you're not really going to be able to make any other turns because nothing else lines up. So you essentially have to backtrack and then figure out that you have to make a 90-degree turn on a layer, and then finally you make a vertical turn and you can once again make more turns. And that's just from the solved state. You encounter this kind of dichotomy just during your entire solve, and it's not always even actually possible to get to a scenario where more cuts line up. So here you can see the puzzle is still cubic, but cuts didn't line up, and then obviously you can turn it by 90 degrees on a side layer, and then make a vertical turn, and then you can make further turns. And this is the best way to just scramble around the corners and edges of the puzzle, because they don't really mix up that well when the puzzle's all shape-shifted. With regards to its solve, I think the cursed Square-1 is genuinely very interesting. So, objectively, what I do have to say is I think puzzle compared to puzzle, Square-1 to cursed Square-1, without any preconceived notions of either, I believe the cursed Square-1 would be easier and more intuitive to solve than a regular Square-1. This is because the state space is smaller, so overall it's a lot more intuitive than a regular Square-1 would be, on which you may have to use specific algorithms to, for example, fix parity or just generally swap around edges, etc. Whereas on the cursed Square-1, you kind of do a bit of the puzzle, and the puzzle does a bit more for you. That's just how these puzzles with limited state spaces work. In fact, several of the solves I've done of the curved Square-1, after I simply oriented all of the edges, meaning white to white, yellow to yellow, I didn't even have to move them around at all, because they were all solved. However, what makes the cursed Square-1 difficult is the fact that you're coming from a Square-1, and thus you have a preconceived notion of how this puzzle should work. And the cursed Square-1 completely defies that in many regards, thus being frustrating because it violates your expectations. And I think that is A, what makes this puzzle really cursed, and B, makes for a really valuable experience that I'm glad I got to enjoy. I think this puzzle is really fun, and I hope you understand why I feel that way. But anyway, let's scramble the cursed Square-1 and see how cursed it really gets. So because of how the cursed Square-1 works, the scrambled state space seems to be significantly more limited than that of a regular Square-1 such as this one. Just a lot of moves that you want to do on this are absolutely impossible on this. And actually that includes the configuration where all 8 edges are next to each other. Because there's 2 distinct types of edges, you physically can't put them all next to each other. However, I think there's a next best thing, which is essentially to just have them all on the same face, but separated by a corner of some sort. And I think from there I should still technically be able to get it back into cube shape. I have solved this puzzle a couple times now, and I think that might be a good strategy than just trying to resolve cube shape without going to some kind of common shape like that. Because it can be an utter nightmare to resolve the cube shape on this because of the amount of moves you can do being very limited. So what I'm going to do is essentially, I see I already have 2 pieces here and 2 pieces here, so I'm going to see if there's some way I can rearrange these parts to all be on this face along with this one. So let's get to it. Alright, and I've achieved my goal. I have this kind of shell shape here, or whatever you want to call this. It looks a little like a conch shell. And then, obviously, only corner parts on the other side. So now I'm thinking it should be relatively straightforward to just get this back into cube shape. I'm not going to speed this up. I'll talk you through the process. So let's see. I want to split this in half, which can't be done like that, so I have to turn it around. And then I also want to split this in half. That works. And then that goes like that. This goes like that. Perfect. And then like that. Okay, yeah, so cube shape is resolved. That was a lot better than my first few solves, where it was kind of a nightmare just due to some decisions I made. I basically tried to go straight for cube shape instead of trying to get it to some situation where all of the edges are on the same face, and this was a much better decision overall. Alright, so I guess here I'll try and get the white and yellow parts on their respective faces. I'm not sure how that's going to turn out because I'm not sure this is a case I've encountered in previous solves, but let's see. Normally, switching around two corners wouldn't be a big deal at all. There's just a really simple sequence of moves you can make in order to achieve that result. But as much as I tried on the cursed Square-1, no relatively simple sequence of moves was able to be made. Just every time I tried to do either the algorithm or a different algorithm or just some sequence, in the middle of it, the turn would be cut off because of the curvature of the pieces. So I had to treat it almost like a parody, where I backed out into a heavily shapeshifted state, did some movements, and then solved the puzzle back into a cube. Definitely way more work than you'd expect just for swapping around two corners. And well, finally these corners are solved. You can see how long that took me from getting to cubic shape to actually getting the corner orientations fixed. That's what happens with this puzzle. You get to a step, you have something that you need to fix, you're like, okay, that's gonna be simple, and then it isn't. I believe I have a strategy now for swapping two corners that are permuted incorrectly. Basically what I did is I got it back to the position where I had 4 edges in a row on each face, and then I swapped the back 3 corners between the faces. I know that's not a very good description, but if you get there you should be able to figure out what that means. Alright, so now I'm going to permute the edges, I guess, to the best of my ability. I haven't had too much trouble with this in the past, but then again I have no idea what kind of curveballs this puzzle's about to throw at me. Alright, so the edges are oriented and now the puzzle is solved. That was completely unintentional. I was for all intents and purposes expecting to have to permute the edges as well, but thankfully that turned out not having to happen. But basically, if I did have to permute the edges, it's a lot more complicated, right? Because obviously this and this are completely different, but these are the same, but these are also different. So likewise, what you could get is a 3 cycle of these two with this one, I believe. Yeah, but you can't really get a 3 cycle on one face. You can have, for example, these two switched and these two switched, and I'll pull up the algorithm on screen right now. I have used that algorithm on this puzzle. It 100% works without any hiccups, so that's also a good hint. Overall, I'd say that if you're bored of a Square-1, this is definitely a refreshing change of pace, and while at times very frustrating, I'd say designing, building, and solving this puzzle has been quite a rewarding experience, and I'm definitely glad I went with it. I can't guarantee that this will be available anytime soon, but in theory, this is a very simple mechanism to create, so maybe. We'll see what happens in the future. I need to figure a couple other things out before I sell any more puzzles. But yeah, that's about it for the curved Square-1, renamed to the cursed Square-1. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a great day.